Welcome, I hope you can all hear me, to the 17th meeting of the Rural Economy and Connectivity meeting. I'd like to point out at this stage that apologies have been received from Mike Rumbles. Before I start the formal part of this meeting, as laid out on the agenda, I'd like to make a brief statement on behalf of the committee. At 9:43 hours this morning, railways across Scotland and across much of Britain fell silent to mark the tragic derailment of a train just 1 week ago at Stonehaven. This accident resulted in the sad loss of 3 lives. Time will tell what lessons need to be learned from this accident to ensure it's never repeated. But now, we would like to pass on our thoughts and support to Brett, Donald's and Christopher's families. We know and can appreciate how deeply you will miss them, as indeed will all their friends and all their work colleagues. To all of you, we would like to say we share your pain. And I'd also like to place on record our thanks to all of those in the emergency services who responded to this event. They did so in a way that demonstrated their true professionalism. I'd like to now return to the agenda and move to item 1, which is the Fisheries Bill. And this relates to the committee's consideration of a legislative consent motion, LCM S541, lodged by Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Connectivity. The LCM relates to the Fisheries Bill, which is in the UK Parliament. As a lead committee, we are required to reflect upon the memorandum and then consider whether we are content with its terms, and then we will report our findings to the Parliament. The DPLR committee considered this LCM yesterday, and committee members have a note of their comments. I'd like to welcome from the Scottish Government, Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Tourism, Caroline Cowan, the Head of EU Exit Marine Scotland, Paul McCarthy, the Policy Manager, and Mary Penman, a lawyer for the Scottish Government. Now, Cabinet Secretary, I think you would like to make an opening statement of up to 3 minutes. Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Convener, and good morning to all members of the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss this morning the UK Fisheries Bill and the Legislative Consent Memorandum. You will have noted, of course, that I have recommended that we consent to the bill as introduced in full. Unlike other UK bills, the cooperative working between officials and indeed ministers in the Scottish Government and DEFRA and the other devolved administrations, Convener, do demonstrate what can be achieved when the UK Government seek to work with us and not impose their plans upon us. I would also contend, Convener, that the bill, frankly, would be the poorer without our input. This input of Scottish expertise and knowledge has, I believe, significantly improved the bill from the original draft and from its previous iteration, and I think DEFRA has recognised this as well. Of course, this government believes that the failure of the UK government to seek an extension to the Brexit transition period is reckless and is creating unhelpful cliff edges on a host of policy matters, including fisheries. However, we've been clear that as a responsible government, we will work on a four-nation basis, so we are as prepared as we can be for the end of the transition period. The Fisheries Bill seeks to ensure that we have a legal framework to operate outside of the EU so that we can deliver sustainable fisheries management in tandem with the protection of the marine environment. I'm confident that this bill gives the Scottish ministers and the Scottish Parliament the necessary powers and tools to do that in a way that respects devolution. I appreciate, Convener, that there is some concern about Parliament's role in some of the provisions set out in the bill. I fully agree that Parliament should continue to have the ability to undertake effective scrutiny. The Joint Fisheries Statement, which sets shared high-level objectives for the whole UK, will be laid in each of the 4 legislatures before being finalised. When it comes to UK-wide legislation, I would envisage this being the exception, certainly, and not the norm. And I welcome that the protocol that is being developed, that again will ensure the Parliament has a scrutiny role, and I'm happy to discuss this further if the committee wishes. Finally, whilst the LCM relates to the bill as introduced, you may be aware, Convener, that a number of amendments were added to the bill in the Lords stages. I've written to the UK Fisheries Minister Victoria Prentice setting out our position on these, and in particular I'm keen for the amendments on landing and remote electronic monitoring to remain in the legislation, but cannot accept them as currently drafted as they clearly impinge on the devolution settlement. I've therefore asked my officials to work with DEFRA to see if modifications can be made to protect devolution, and I will keep the committee informed of developments as necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ewing. Now, there are some questions, and I think, John Finney, you're going to start off with the first question. John Finney, John.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and your team. Cabinet Secretary, you talked about the House of Lords there, and I wonder, with regard to fisheries management plans, if I can quote some of the information that we've received about the passage through the Lords there, where a number of individuals highlighted the lack of legally binding duties and targets for achieving fishery objectives, including sustainable fisheries stocks and net zero emission fishing fleets and duties to fish at sustainable levels. Now, we've received representations from a number of Marine Conservation, WWF, RSPB, about putting environmental sustainability first and foremost in a fisheries management scheme. There was also concerns expressed about the absence of a legal duty on Scottish ministers to produce fisheries management plans. So, particularly with regard to the potential for local fishery management plans, could you say how this committee will measure Scottish Government's progress in producing fisheries management plans, please?
Well, thank you. And in response to Mr. Finney's question, I think the starting point is, as members will know, is that a national discussion paper on the future of sea fisheries management was published by myself in 2019. The discussion phase ended last year, and an analysis of the responses to that phase is near completion, and I expect to revert to this committee shortly as to the timescale for publication of that analysis. I have to say that the process, Mr. Finney, was very positive. The responses were very positive. And I think it's absolutely essential that we recognise that we promote the long-term sustainability, environmental, social and economic, as well as the optimum utilisation of stock. And the principles, therefore, of sustainable fisheries have always underlined our approach to negotiations, but they have also been set out very clearly in our discussion paper, The Future of Fisheries Management in Scotland, with fisheries as a devolved topic. With regard to the particular technicalities of the House of Lords amendments, we are supportive of the intentions of the amendments, but think that further work needs to be done on the technical wording of them. And I wonder, Convener, since Mr. Finney's question was partly technical, if I could pass to Carol Cowan and her officials to respond to the technical aspects of the question Mr. Finney raised.
Absolutely. John, do you want to come back at this stage or listen to the officials before Mr. Ewing brings them in?
If I could briefly thank the Cabinet Secretary for that. In the submission I have here in front of me, we're told, and I quote here, in Scotland, the Marine Atlas identifies fishing as the most widespread pressure on our seas alongside climate change, and the National Performance Framework Indicator on Sustainability of Fish Stocks shows that just 54% harvest sustainably. So clearly we would want to understand what steps can be taken to enhance that, please.
Cabinet Secretary, do you want to bring your officials in now?
Well, I think so. We are guided by sustainability, and we pursue that principle always in the negotiations. And of course, in practice, what it means, Convener, is that we take advice from ICES, scientific advice, and the negotiations are informed by that science. And that is the approach we take. But I think the original question did involve some technical aspects about the legislation itself. So I think it might be helpful if Carol Cowan could come in, or indeed bring one of the other two officials in if she thinks appropriate. Thank you.
Caroline.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. So I'll try and address different parts. So with regard to the fisheries management plans, each administration, in I think it's clause 6, if I remember rightly, of the bill, is required to produce fisheries management plans. So there is that legal obligation to do so. Obviously, in terms of indicators, we're still working across the 4 administrations to use existing ones, such as in the National Performance Framework, but also those set by ICES and in things such as the Sustainable Development Goals and under UNCLOS, to identify exactly what indicators will be used. And if I understand rightly, they'll be part of the plans. That's on measuring progress. In regard to the House of Lords amendments, as the Cabinet Secretary says, the key issue that concern there is around the devolution aspects. As written, they don't allow the Scottish Ministers and Scottish Parliament to produce the regulations that's in an area within our competence. So we're seeking to work with our UK government colleagues to see if we can address that. And I would also remind Mr. Finney, of course, there is the climate change objective in the bill as well. So we are required to demonstrate how we're meeting that climate change objective. If I remember rightly, of course, we have our own Scottish Climate Change Act with certain targets and obligations. Thank you.
Okay, John, did that answer your questions?
I'm grateful for the detail in that reply. It didn't cover the aspect of local fishery management plans. If I could hear something about that, please, Camilla.
Mr. Ewing, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think if Carol could carry on, that would be probably quicker, Convener.
If I may, I'll then hand over. Oh, sorry, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Paul McCarthy, who's the lead on these matters.
Hello, I'll just try and briefly cover this topic. As Mr. Finney has noted, there is an obligation on the 4 fisheries administrations to produce fisheries management plans. We'd be looking at mainly those plans to cover the stocks that are shared between the administrations. So the widely distributed stocks, or the stocks in the North Sea, like haddock, whiting, cod. For the more local stocks, like crab, lobster, which are not shared, I believe we're looking to bring forward management plans through our Future of Fisheries Management group, Future of Fisheries Management consultation document. And they will, I imagine, though I'm not as linked into this area, but I imagine they will mainly be steered through the regional inshore fisheries groups, which are our main cooperative body for management of local inshore fisheries. Thank you.
Okay, I have a quick question my question, Mr. Ewing, is just simply the fishery management plans. Will those be laid before Parliament, and will Parliament have a chance to scrutinise them?
I think we will wish to consult Parliament. As far as the legislative commitment is concerned, to be accurate, I'd just like to check with officials to see whether there is any specific legal requirement. But as you know, Convener, we are subject to, quite properly, scrutiny as we are now and in the future. And the approach that I seek to take is to involve fully Parliament in any substantive issue of importance. And I do hope that that's an approach I've followed. But I don't want to transgress and commit to any technical infelicity. So I'll pass to our legal expert, Paul, to answer that, if I may, Mr. McCarthy.
Definitely, Minister. As the committee will be aware, there is a legal obligation on the 4 administrations to lay the draft of the joint fishery statements before each legislature for scrutiny. There is no similar obligation on individual fisheries management plans, but within the joint fishery statement must contain a list of all the fisheries management plans which will be taken forward. It is then up for individual administrations to decide on how best to consult on the details of each of the individual fisheries management plans. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. The next question then is going to come from Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener, and Good morning, panel. Just before I ask my question, Cabinet Secretary, you said that there had been good cooperation between among the governments on this fisheries bill, which is to be welcomed. But can you tell us how the Scottish Government managed to strengthen the bill, and are you confident that the devolved competences will be respected, given, I think, as the DPLR committee highlighted, that there is a lot of power devolved to the Secretary of State rather than to the Scottish Government?
Well, thank Ms Watt for that question, Convener. If I could respond with, I think perhaps possibly the most important point I'll make this morning is that we are not delegating powers, legal powers, to the UK government. What we're proposing to do is, in certain circumstances where it's a matter of important administrative convenience, to pass functions to the UK government to be carried out. But it's important to emphasise a point of principle that in recommending this LCM today, we are not, in my judgment and on the advice I've had from my legal advisors, Convener, doing anything which passes powers to the UK government. In putting it in another way, nothing would be done without our consent. Any decision to allow the UK government to exercise the decisions in relation to matters would only be taken with on the basis that we consent to these functions being carried out in this way. I mean, I can give a couple of examples, which I think is really what getting to the meat of the thing. They are quite detailed though, but for example, the conversion factors for weighing fish, if they were different in one part of the UK, would give an effect the additional quota to that part of the UK. That's where fish are gutted on a vessel before landings, and the decision has to be made about measuring the landings in terms of assessing the quota utilisation. If those rules were different in parts of the UK, it would be tantamount to Convener to passing additional quota. Now, that's a technicality. I thought the committee would be interested to know what exactly it would mean in practice. That's one example. But I think the key thing is nothing done without our consent. Things that the fishing community wish to be done without, if you like, politics intruding, can be done by administrative arrangement, but only if the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament are broadly in favour of that.
Thank you for that. My question originally was to follow on from John Finney's questions about sustainable fishing, and you and I, Cabinet Secretary, have been in this game long enough to know how important it is that all parties involved agree on the data, and you know, it's taken us a long time to get to sustainable yields, and a lot of it is based on the data that we get from ICES. Will all parties in negotiations going forward still have access to the same data, presumably from ICES?
Yeah, my understanding is yes, that is the case. I mean, plainly, the negotiations, international negotiations, need to be informed by science that is acknowledged internationally. That does not mean, Convener, that there are not occasions where that advice is subject to questioning. There are particular issues which arises when it is argued that the data on which ICES draw their conclusions may be slightly out of date, and where patterns of movement of fish from one block to another, for example, fishermen argue may not have been taken account of in those conclusions. That's just one example. But I think the key thing is that the advice will be informed by internationally accepted evidence, and that's the only way that international negotiations can be conducted. The bill by itself is a piece of paper. I mean, it cannot in itself guarantee sustainable fisheries management. We need to have a set of policies, as do all other nations, recognising international obligations, but also the need to apply those obligations in practice for sustainable fisheries management, taking into account environmental, social and economic factors.
A brief follow-up, Maureen, if you'd like one.
Thank you, that's fine.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, Rachel Hamilton, I think you had a question at this stage.
The fishing objectives are not legally binding duties, and therefore targets are not set. So how can, sort of following on from John Finney's question, how can you ensure that sustainable fishing is practiced to ensure a future for the livelihood of fishermen and their communities, and indeed for future generations?
Mr. Ewing.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very wide question, but broadly speaking, Convener, legislation sets out a set of principles, and then it's up to governments, either nationally or internationally, in this case, nationally and internationally, to apply those principles in practice. As I said in response to Ms. Watt's question a moment ago, legislation itself cannot guarantee sustainable fisheries. There needs to be a willingness and a shared determination, really, to address Mr. Finney's question, to apply that in practice. So law in itself, as I've said before, is words on a page. It does need to be implemented in a way that meets our environmental aspirations, but also provides fishermen and fishing communities with a reasonable return. And that does involve the application of these principles in practice. I'm not quite sure what Ms. Hamilton is getting at, and if there's a technical aspect as to the precise significance of law in this respect, then if Mr. McCarthy has anything to add, either he can do so now, or if time doesn't permit, Convener, obviously respond to the committee, although I think time is short for consideration of this matter.
It is indeed. Rachel, does that answer your question, or do you want to come briefly back in?
Well, I suppose just a comment that Baroness Young of Old Scone made with regards to putting a legally binding duty on the public authorities to achieve these objectives and to be accountable. So it's kind of, I mean, maybe we'll come to this when we talk about it in the chamber if we're short for time.
Thank you. We'll then move on to the next question, which is from Stewart Stevenson. Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish having additional duties with Brexit. I just want to explore fairly briefly resources to support enforcement. In particular, I might start with, given that Scotland is about half of the UK's fishing industry, and a great deal more than that in terms of fishing opportunities, and barring consequentials that we might derive from additional expenditure south of the border would only be provided on a population basis, and therefore only cover a very small fraction of any additional costs that we might incur. Has the government, has the Cabinet Secretary had discussions about the additional resources that will be available to Scotland that were, of course, promised during the Brexit referendum debates by the government, promised by politicians?
Convener, yes, I have had discussions about these matters with a succession of ministers, principally with George Eustace, who is now Secretary of State, but formerly was the Fisheries Minister. So I have had constructive discussions with him. To answer Mr. Stevenson's question directly, I mean, I think it is undoubtedly the case that with the share of fish that it lies off Scotland's coasts, that we feel that the funding received under the EMFF, the European Maritime Fisheries Fund, has not provided sufficient commensurate financial support for overall investment in things like, ports and harbours, improved capacity, ice making equipment, a whole load of really valuable things for the industry. And the second issue, and that's been the case within the EU, I mean, we have had funding, but I don't think sufficiently fair funding. And secondly, within the UK, we have not yet had clarity about the future replacement of EMFF post-Brexit. My understanding, Convener, is that these are not really matters that will be determined by this bill, which covers a lot of things here, as members know. This is more, I think, an issue of discussion, consideration with the UK government. But I can absolutely assure Mr. Stevenson that this is a matter that's extremely serious. I've raised it with successive Secretaries of State. The matter was talked about when Mr. Gove made a recent visit to Scotland and where we met in Buckie. And I and colleagues raised this and other issues in the course of that meeting. So I would say it's an extremely important issue, Convener, as are many other issues, but it's not one that will in itself be determined by the provisions of this bill as I understand it.
Thank you, Fergus. Next person to ask a question is Peter Chapman. Peter.
Hi, thank you, Convener. And can I start by giving my thanks to Mr. Ewing and his officials for the positive way that this legislation has been proceeded, has been going forward. I mean, it's great to see the two governments working constructively together, and I hope this is an example of how future negotiations and very many other issues that Brexit brings up will be able to be conducted. So I do want to put that on record that I think that this is a very positive outcome for our fishermen across the whole of the UK, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for achieving that. I mean, I understand that this bill isn't about the detail, but it would be remiss of me if I didn't ask in behalf of our fishing fleets in the North East, what thoughts has been given to the future pressure from EU countries to continue to fish in our waters as they have done previously? Our fishermen expect a bigger share of our fish in our waters, and I just wonder how much consideration or how much thought has been given as to how we are going to proceed, because we will be out of the EU in a very few short months. Our fishermen are expecting to have bigger opportunities to catch fish in our own waters, and I just briefly would ask about where we are with these sort of thoughts and discussions.
Mr. Ewing, Fergus.
Well, Convener, thank Mr. Chapman for his gracious comments, and it is right that we should be constructive where we can, and I can be persistent. Some people may even say difficult, but never gratuitously so, only to stand up for Scotland's interests. And I found that a good workmanlike relationship with Mr. Eustace in particular is an assistance, and I have worked with him at the Brussels negotiations for the last 4 years. So that does tend to build up a closer relationship. And I think between officials is probably, if anything, more important, actually, Convener, because they work on a day-to-day basis that perhaps doesn't happen in other areas. But I don't want really to get carried away as if this is some sort of glee club, because it ain't. And, just yesterday I had a conference call with leading players in the prawn sector. They're really worried at the moment about the future of the prawn sector and the potential continued loss of the Spanish market, even after COVID, hopefully, finds some kind of solution. And at the meeting with Mr. Gove in Buckie, there were real concerns about loss of market coming from processors and fishermen, and lack of clarity about EMFF, and also, I think, issues about the continued availability of labour post-Brexit. So there are differences, but yes, in the negotiations, to answer the second part of Mr. Chapman's question, my job is to make sure that Scotland's interests are best represented. And sadly, although at the meeting in Buckie I did ask Mr. Gove this, he hasn't come back to us yet. and that is that we should be involved in the talks, not just outside the room getting a briefing afterwards.
Thank you, Monsieur. I'm just going to say to everyone, I know this is important and I don't want to curtail anyone's questions, but short questions, short answers always make conveners happy. And I like to be a happy chappy, as it were. So I'm going to move on to Emma Harper and ask her for her questions, please. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You mentioned that the Fisheries Bill is better due to input from the Scottish Government. That is good to hear. So that might be worth expanding on. But I'm also interested, Cabinet Secretary, if you can clarify that this bill does or does not work with inshore fisheries legislation. Fishing within the established exclusive economic zone, I think, is up to 12 miles in our territorial waters. And John Finney mentioned fisheries management plans. And so I know crab and lobster and scallops are really important in West Coast, especially in the Solway waters in the Irish Sea. So could the Cabinet Secretary clarify a wee bit more about whether this bill applies to inshore fishing?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it sets out principles which will apply to all fishing, but it will apply to different segments of the fisheries sector in different ways. Some fish species are subject to quota regulation and some are not. So, nephrops are, for example, but other shellfish types may not be. I mean, this is largely a technical issue. I think I would answer it by saying that fishing is devolved to Scotland, and inshore fisheries management is substantially the responsibility of the Scottish Government. We set out some proposals for reform and improvement of inshore management, particularly to allow decisions more to be taken at a local level amongst those involved, with a greater input locally rather than directed from Edinburgh, but also things like bringing new entrants in where the cost of new vessels and licences is the overall cost of getting in is quite high, and possibly with additional quota being devoted in part to that and in part to preserving them for local communities. So these are things, Convener, that we can do. I think my understanding is that these types of things won't really be impeded at all by this bill. If they were, we would have had a lot to say about it. I don't know if I'm conscious that each of these questions involves a policy substantive element and a technical element. So if in any way I have misspoken, as it were, on the technicalities, Convener, then I'll maybe ask my officials to correct it today, if that's okay. But I don't think I have. So I'll maybe just, rather than bring them in and take up more time, I'll maybe just pass back to the next question.
Okay, Emma, I'm going to move on, if I may, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for offering to come back to us to clarify if there's anything that's not quite spot on. Colin Smyth, you've got some questions. Colin.
Thank you very much, Convener. Can I ask a question regarding the fisheries objectives? In their consideration of the bill, the Clear Committee noted that in reality some objectives will be prioritised over others, and the bill does not include a dispute mechanism. This was obviously an issue also raised in the House of Lords debate. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, how does he envisage joint working to manage trade-offs between the different fisheries objectives, or to manage disputes between fisheries management authorities? And does the government think clarity is needed on the hierarchy of the fisheries objectives? For example, could the relative importance of the different objectives be made clearer in the bill?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, again, there's a substantive and a technical aspect to this, but on the substantive side, I mean, it's my experience for years now that the application of the principles is done in practice by a long-established process of negotiation. Some of these negotiations are carried out infra the UK, some of these negotiations are carried out with the EU, and some of these negotiations are carried out with countries such as Norway, Iceland and the Faroe Islands. And that this is a long-established process, that the negotiations are always informed by science and will continue to be informed by science. Leaving the EU doesn't mean that we dispose of the requirement to have regard to sustainability. But these principles, I think, are best put into practice by governments who are all subject to international law and who engage not only with the fishing interests, but with the environmental NGOs, who I will be meeting again shortly to discuss all of these important issues. And I think the role of law here should be to set out the principles rather than try to dictate a particular approach, which I think is fraught with issues. That's my substantive response, Convener. I don't really think there's a need for a technical answer. So, but again, we will come back if there is a technical argument of which I'm not fully versed, and we'll freely do that, because I appreciate that an LCM is substantially a technical measure, but members are quite rightly concerned about very important substantive policy issues.
Colin, do you have a follow-up, or are you happy that I move on to Angus? He's got a few questions there.
Happy to move on, Convener.
Thank you very much, Colin. So I'd like to come to Angus, if I may. Angus MacDonald.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You may be aware that the Eclair Committee, of which I'm also a member, has raised a number of points to this committee, including issues raised by peers in the House of Lords, which has already been referred to this morning. In addition, Eclair have noted your previous reference to the Scottish Government's intention to dynamically align with EU standards and regulations. So, given that, and given the keeping pace provisions in the Scottish Government's continuity bill, to what extent within the UK internal market will Scotland have the practical ability to get or set different policies for fisheries?
Well,
thank you. I think this is largely a technical question, but there is the ability for policy divergence where that is appropriate within the four nations of the UK. So I'm satisfied that is the case. And the key point here is the one that no decisions would be taken with regard to the exercise of powers without the consent of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament. And it's important that the Government and the Parliament work together to get a modus operandi about how all this works out in practice. But I think this probably is mostly a technical issue, so I would be grateful if Carol Cowan could have an opportunity just to add anything that she thinks is germane.
Carol.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Yes, so in terms of the bill, as Mr Ewing says, the Joint Fisheries Statement recognises, the process recognises that different policies may be applied in each administration, recognising the spatial and biological nature of fisheries. In terms of interactions with other environmental legislation, my understanding is the continuity bill applies to all areas within the Scottish Parliament competence, so anything in that would have application to fisheries right out to the 200-mile zone. Clearly on marine environments it's a little bit more complex because of executive devolution. If the committee is interested in that, we can, of course, probably best to write further given the complexities. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Okay. Angus, I'd like to bring you back in, if I may, briefly with one further question.
Okay, thanks, Convener. I do have more via the Eclair Committee, so if we could perhaps write to the Cabinet Secretary with the ones that we can't cover, that would be helpful. But I think it's fair to say, to the frustration of, I think, everyone, information is not yet available about the common frameworks, which will set out the detail of the governance arrangements, and it's fairly unhelpful that we can't scrutinise the governance arrangements covered by the common framework alongside the legislative proposals. So can you shed any light, Cabinet Secretary, on where this bill fits in to the common UK framework on fisheries?
Well, this bill sets out the overarching legislative principles, and they then need to be applied in practice. And yes, there is a lot of work to be done. I hope that work can be done adopting a constructive approach. I think the framework it sets out, which preserves the principle of the Scottish Parliament not being obliged to do things or forced to do with anything without its consent is the key issue here. Where there is a will to work together, I think that can happen. I think my concerns really about fisheries issues are really more about the political decisions, Convener, the negotiations that are being conducted as we speak in Brussels, the access to markets, the availability of financial support, the access to labour, the fact that we can't solve the ridiculous restrictions that apply to crew, particularly from the Philippines, is just absurd. It's been on for years and years and years. And I'm afraid that we've argued with the UK government, with support, I think, from across parties in Scotland. We haven't got anywhere. So I think there's a distinction to be made here between legal issues and substantive issues. And the legal provisions in this bill, in my view, won't really directly impact on very many of the substantive issues where the issue is more of political consideration rather than technical legal matters, Convener. I think that's a key distinction, that, you know, whatever one's views about substantive issues, most of them really won't be determined by this bill.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Now, Angus wants to come back in, Angus, but if it's very brief.
Yeah, it will be, Convener. Just one salient point, picking up on what the Cabinet Secretary said there. What arrangements are in place for the Scottish Government to participate in the international negotiations in relation to fisheries, which you referred to now and earlier?
Cabinet
Is there anything to say?
Well, I think the answer to that is that the UK government has not agreed to the request that we have made and made repeatedly, and most recently at the said meeting in Buckie with Mr Gove, where, as always, impeccably polite, he undertook earnestly to revert to me, but, you know, I'm still waiting. Never too late, Michael. So we haven't, to be serious, we have requested that we be fully involved. We haven't been so. Our officials have been involved to some extent, but I think that the risk is, unless they're involved to the fuller extent, for example, that we normally enjoy in the annual round of negotiations in Brussels, and also the vital negotiations with Norway, Faroes and Iceland, then there is the risk, and it's a fairly commonsensical risk, that decisions are taken without Scotland's position being fully set out, expounded and advocated, leading to potential detriment to Scotland. I think that's a salient risk, setting aside the larger political questions about how realistic it is that the UK government will implement the promise of the Sea of Opportunity, which was the promise made during the Brexit referendum campaign and subsequently.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Now, I'm afraid time has been quite limited, and the committee has been under quite a lot of pressure regarding this LCM for timings-wise, and to get the reports back from the DPLR, which is less than satisfactory. But we are where we are. I have posed the question, and I haven't had a response from anyone on the committee. So it appears that we are, in principle, agreed with the LCM, but there are some questions, Cabinet Secretary, that we haven't been managed to ask. Now, I don't believe that there is any intention from any member of the committee to hold up the process of the LCM, but we would ask that the clerks are going to write to you with those questions, so for a matter of record that we can have answers for those, and therefore I think that's probably the best way of dealing with it. So I'm going to ask the question, and hopefully the answer is agreed, that are the members content that we recommend in the committee's report that the Parliament should agree to the draft motion set out in the LCM? And obviously, Cabinet Secretary, when the questions come in, those will be circulated to the answers will be circulated to committee members. So I see from the other means that we're all agreed. So I'd like to thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and the witnesses for participating in this remote committee meeting. And I'm very briefly going to suspend the meeting before we move on to the next item, to allow broadcasting to shuffle the players round on the screen. So thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and I suspend the meeting. Thank you very much, and we're now going to move on to agenda item 2. This is an evidence session on digital connectivity. This is our regular update on digital connectivity and broadband issues from the Scottish Government. Our last one was in fact in January, so I'd like to welcome from the Scottish Government Paul Wheelhouse, the Minister for Energy, Connectivity in the Islands, Clive Downing, the R100 Programme Director, and Robbie McGee, the Deputy Director of Digital Connectivity of the Scottish Government. Minister, would you like to make a brief opening statement, please, of up to 3 minutes?
Thank you, Convener. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm very grateful for the opportunity this morning. Can I firstly associate myself very much with your opening remarks around the tragic events at Stonehaven and your kind words towards the emergency services as well. I'm very pleased to be here today to update the committee on our progress towards ensuring every home and business in Scotland has access to superfast broadband at speeds of 30 megabits per second or better. Excuse me. Whilst this committee is very well aware of the importance of digital connectivity, the last few months have, of course, thrown us into even sharper focus, as we've all had to adapt how we work, including this morning, how we access healthcare, how we do business, and how we socialise with friends and family. You requested that today's session focuses on each of the 3 contract areas, or lots, which I may refer to during the course of the meeting, of the Reaching 100% or R100 programme. And I also sought to answer your queries in writing on the Scottish Broadband Voucher Scheme, which I hope was useful, but I'm happy to answer anything further on this. Before we move on to R100, I'd just like to spend a few moments putting on the record my huge appreciation for the difference that the Digital Scotland Superfast Broadband, or DSSB programme, has made. The Highlands and Islands contract will continue building until the latter part of this year, reaching further locations in the Western Isles, Highland Council and Murray. And despite challenges due to COVID-19, the Rest of Scotland contract kept up momentum and is now in the close-down phase. Together, these contracts have laid over 16,000 kilometres of fibre cable, installed over 5,000 roadside cabinets and connected over 950,000 premises. That's 110,000 more than initially expected. And so I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who was involved in that DSSB programme and on behalf of our partners, and that their efforts have helped extend fibre broadband to around 98% of premises across Scotland, and according to Think Broadband data, around 94% have superfast broadband access, a remarkable achievement in combination with commercial development, of course, and I hope the committee will join me in expressing their gratitude and appreciation. As you're aware, the provision of broadband infrastructure is primarily a commercial matter, and on that front, telecoms infrastructure providers are rolling out further and faster, with regular announcements of new fibre investment across Scotland from, for example, Openreach, Virgin Media and City Fibre. But we also know that commercial rollout alone will not ensure 100% access to the connectivity we all need and have now come to expect. So at the end of last year, I announced we'd signed contracts with BT for the central £83 million and the south £133 million lots of the R100 procurements, and I'm pleased to be able to tell you that work is now underway in both of these lots. Detailed survey work is completed in Biggar, with further detailed survey work underway in areas including Dumfries, Maybole, South Queensferry, Burnt Island and Perth, and we'd expect the first premises to be able to directly benefit from these new services by the end of this calendar year. Also, as of this week, residents and business owners can now use our updated online address checker, find out whether they are covered by one of these 2 contracts, when to expect access, and whether they're eligible for a voucher from the Scottish Broadband Voucher Scheme. And this will prove a useful tool to individuals and businesses as we move through delivery of R100. Our main voucher, the SBVS scheme, will be available to connect the relatively small number of premises that are not going to be able to be reached by the contracts we've in place. In addition, an interim voucher will ensure each and every premises can obtain access by the end of 2021, irrespective of whether they are in later contract plans, for example, if they're due to receive full fibre investment, but only after the 31st of December next year. And we've also been working closely with the UK Government to join up our respective voucher funding and processes to maximise the impact across Scotland. And I can now confirm that an agreement is in place, and we'll be able to say more on that in the near future alongside my counterpart Matt Warman. Given the ongoing legal challenge, I'm sure members will appreciate I cannot comment on the detail of the R100 North lot itself, but can confirm that those customers in the North can benefit from the SBVS funding to make progress while that court case is underway. But I'm happy to answer any questions relating to other aspects of R100, Convener, and thank you for your forbearance this morning.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I would just say to everyone, please, there are a lot of questions here. So short questions, short answers always work well. So the first question is from Emma Harper. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Good morning, Minister Wheelhouse. I welcome the work that the Minister and your team are taking forward to connect Scotland. It's obviously demonstrated a necessity because of coronavirus and everybody working and schooling and doing their business from home. I'm interested in issues around the changing completion dates. I'm wondering if the Minister can confirm whether the completion dates for Lot 2 Central and Lot 3, which is the South lot, are there likely to be breach of contract penalties if the completion dates are missed?
Well, certainly, as clearly we have identified that, and thank Emma Harper for her kind remarks and for her question indeed. Clearly we are affected by the impact of COVID-19, but thankfully not as significantly as I would have feared, as work on the R100 programme has been up to now mainly desk-based until outdoor works resume, which are now happening in both central and south lot areas. There's been no known impact to date as a result of COVID-19 itself. And obviously we put physical distancing and lockdown measures in place. You asked fair points around the constraints around on the contractors in terms of delivery. We are working very closely with Openreach and BT to try and maximise the rate at which we can build out the programme and ensure that we do everything we can to avoid delays. The contracts are state-funded interventions which enable the contractor to deploy its own infrastructure in areas that are not commercially viable, and the asset network is owned by the contractor on completion, and it's obviously delivering a series of phase milestones. Payment for each phase is made based on the actual cost of deployment, and to those premises, and will not be made if they're not connected without reason. And once a milestone has been achieved, there is a further attention to ensure the network is also performing correctly before payment is made. However, it's relevant to point out the performance of DSSB, the supplier, as was the case there, has a big incentive to deliver early because they do not start receiving income from premises until the customers are actually signed up to services, and thankfully we've had a higher take-up in Scotland than we'd initially modelled under that programme. So I hope it's of some comfort that I think both there's a commercial incentive for BT to deliver quickly, but we'll continually monitor delivery of R100, and that payments are linked to the actual connection of infrastructure, testing of the infrastructure and making sure it's working. So I would hope we'll have everybody is working together to try and get as fast a result as possible. We continue to look at how we can work with BT and Openreach to try and accelerate the build, catch up on progress.
Emma.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
I neglected to answer the point that Ms Harper raised regarding dates. I think it'd probably be fair just to help the committee. We still expect the vast majority of the contract build in the south and centre to be completed by the end of 2023. I appreciate that's beyond 2021, and hence why we have put in place the voucher option for people who need to service before that timescale. But by the end of 2023, we expect 96% of the contract build in central to be complete, and in excess of 80% for the south lot. The south lot obviously has full delivery of fibre to the premises, which is a slower build, but we hopefully will see those customers who need an earlier service can obviously benefit from the interim voucher that we announced this week.
Thank you. Sorry, Emma.
Okay, thank you. I welcome the announcement about the vouchers, actually. There are three elements, Minister, about the R100 programme: procurement, commercial build and aligned interventions. Can you confirm that the £600 million allocation is just for procurement element, and is the 600 million accurate still, given the time delays?
Yes, I can, Convener. Ms Harper raises another fair question. Certainly the 600 million does just cover the procurement, the 3 procurement lots that I've referenced, so the north, south and central lots. It does not cover the cost of the Scottish Broadband Voucher Scheme, which is additional to that. And so therefore I can confirm that we will be committing additional funds on top of the 600 million to deliver the voucher scheme. Hope that's helpful to Ms Harper.
And just finally, you just mentioned that 96% of premises in the central lot will have connected and 80% in the south. I'm wondering, is that percentage coverage directly and solely attributable to government intervention rather than commercial rollout? For example, the central lot, it says 47,000 premises have been reached. What proportion will be by R100 intervention and what proportion will be by commercial coverage?
Absolutely keen to answer that. I mean, I should make clear when I was referencing the 96% and the 81% would actually be for the south, that's in reference to the remaining properties that R100 is delivering. So we already have a situation in much of central and South Scotland lot areas where coverage is in excess of 80%. So in the case of the south of Scotland, for example, in the borders, we already have well over 80%. In fact, I can give the figures for Ms Harper, I know she's interested in Dumfries and Galloway. 85.8% is already the figure in Dumfries and Galloway for superfast coverage, and in the borders, for example, be 87.8%. So the figures I quoted there were in reference to the properties that are covered by our lots, i.e. the remaining premises that have yet to be connected. And if I can help in terms of the figures that Emma Harper was quoting there, in the south lot there are now approximately 22,000 premises in the updated intervention area. That was a reduction from 27,000 when I think I last addressed the committee, and that's because of additional commercial build. And BT indicate they'll build to around 21,000 of those 22,000 in the south through the R100 contract itself. They will deliver commercially around 800, and that leaves actually a precise figure of 194 that would have to benefit from the main voucher that we've announced this week, the £5,000 voucher. And in respect of the central area, we have just trying to see, contract 32,000, I believe, of the 41,000 in that area would be delivered to R100, remaining 9,000 for premises BT indicate they'll build to around 4,700 of those, leaving about 4,000, just over 4,000 that are eligible for the voucher scheme. So that gives you your total of 41,000 between those three groups. Hope that's helpful to the committee, Convener.
Just a final point. It would be useful for the Minister to give us an update on the number of houses that are coming down and down and down, because I think everybody will be welcoming the R100 programme as it's rolled out. Get everybody connected. So thanks.
We can certainly do that in writing, Convener, if that would be helpful, just to give updated totals for the contracts. Obviously, I can't comment on the composition in the North Lot area, regrettably. We can give the overall number, perhaps, but not the split, because it is determined by the outcome of the legal challenge. But we can certainly give figures more detail for North and Central, Central and South, just to confirm those for the committee members.
Thank you, Minister. The next questions are from Stewart Stevenson. Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you to Minister for your parliamentary answer that you gave me earlier in the week on the voucher scheme. Although I do just want to, before moving on, which you may wish to reply in writing, I just wonder where the database of addresses for the voucher scheme has come from, because it is, in my personal inquiries, it simply doesn't match the Royal Mail list of addresses. My postcode, Royal Mail, has 6 houses in. Your database has 5, 4 of which are in the Royal Mail, and 1 of which doesn't appear in the Royal Mail. So 2 of the postcodes the Royal Mail has, including my own, are missing from the database used for the voucher. And just to clarify, That's the same with the UK USO, where I'm also missing from the database. So I think there's some issues that you might care to, because I don't imagine my postcode is uniquely being singled out for the difficulty. So I'd like to know where the database for the postcodes has come from, and I expect you'll have to write to me on that, because I'm feeling pretty wary about it. Right, but Minister, let me move to a more substantive matter and more generally important. One of the concerns about the Northern contract, which I think you will be able to speak about, is the state aid issue, where I think you've previously indicated that you were going to approach the UK government to see if we can extend that, because if it expires at the end of the year without resolution of the legal process, and I'm not asking you to refer to that, we might have some other difficulties. So I wonder where we stand with that, and as complementary to that, what contingency plans have you in place if the issue is not resolved before the state aid consent expires?
Well, if I can respond to that last point first, and I'll come back to Mr. Stevenson's legitimate sort of worries about the address checker, and we will come back with more detail on this. I've received some detail overnight, because I should say that our engineers have been working overnight to try and address some of those challenges for the first day's operation, where some addresses didn't match the databases. Ours, we believe, is the most up-to-date database, but it does yield some problems. But in terms of the Northlock contract, I appreciate it's of keen interest to a lot of members of the committee. Mr. Stevenson's absolutely right. There is a potential risk around the 2016 broadband state aid regime, which was approved by the Commission and is governed obviously by the European Union. And this regime expires at the end of 2020. While there's obviously no European funding being utilised in R100 itself, the state aid cover that allows for public investment in commercial markets is governed by that agreement. And given the reserve nature telecoms legislation, it is for the UK government to ensure a successor state aid scheme or an extension can be applied and is negotiated with the European Commission or its successor, and the Competition and Markets Authority, which is the proposed successor. I'm pleased to say we've had some positive discussions with Matt Warman, who have got a developing good relationship with, and we have impressed upon Mr. Warman the urgency for such an agreement to be reached, with this being the subject of discussion at recent meetings at both official and ministerial level between ourselves and UK government counterparts. And to date, I can't speak for Mr. Warman, but he's been constructive in his approach so far and recognises the issue. But we obviously have to respect the fact that's a reserved matter, and leave it for UK ministers to pursue. But we'll keep up the communication in that, and hopefully we'll get a favourable position. We have also made clear, I should say for the record, our own willingness to assist in any way possible to progress those negotiations, obviously able to give the details to the European Commission itself on the importance of the programme and why this is essential, without commenting perhaps on the legal challenge itself for obvious reasons. I hope that's helpful to the member. I will send, I've got quite a detailed note from officials around the work that's been done overnight around the address checker. Mr. Stevens is absolutely right. There are issues around the different databases, and sometimes houses have different names to that being used by the Royal Mail in their own database. And I had one example of that yesterday. I was looking at on behalf of someone in the Lochaber area. And there is actually, just to flag up through the committee if I can, that there is a functionality on the website for individuals to contact the team, so they can actually, I'll just try and see if I find the detail of that. But if there's an unexpected error message, they can contact the team and they'll investigate that particular issue on their behalf.
Minister, sorry, if you could just also keep a slight eye on me. I don't want to cut you short, but I think the issue of addresses may be a technical issue, which would be best responded to in writing to the committee, so we could see that, because I think I'm worried there are a lot of questions here, and Stewart Stevenson has another one just to keep you on your toes. Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. I'll wrap up my remaining points into one intervention here. The first one relates to the voucher, the aligned intervention. Can the Minister give us an indication of how many premises he thinks the voucher is likely to apply to? Now, if he doesn't have an exact number, can he at least indicate perhaps that might apply? And the other thing, which I don't know if he can give an answer, he's said for the South and Central, we're now looking at an overall completion date of 2023. Has the government got an indicative date that it thinks, let me put it this way, how long after the resolution of the legal case and whoever ends up with the contract does he think it will take to complete the R100 for the North?
On that second point, Convener, maybe bring in Clive or Robbie to address just the timing. I know there'll be periods to mobilise the R100 contract, depending on who is successful. Obviously, depending on the outcome, that may take longer if it's depending on the outcome of the court's determination. But based on the two previous contracts, it took a number of months clearly to get to the point where we got the contracts agreed and started to mobilise and get the survey work done. So it wouldn't be immediate if the court case concluded and it concluded that we could progress with BT. That's something to bear in mind. But maybe invite Robbie and colleagues and Clive to comment on that. And in terms of the issue around the number of premises in the main voucher scheme cohort, it appears around about, because we're allowing for the main voucher scheme to apply to the north of Scotland as well on a time-limited basis while the court case is underway. Technically, at the moment, there's a number of premises eligible for the main voucher. We think is in the region of 250,000 premises across Scotland. Now, obviously, that will come down if we get the contract in place, and we can then move on a more refined figure. I can give precise figures for the south and central areas if that would be helpful, because that is more obviously known. In the case of the main voucher in the central area, we're talking about 4,310 and 194 in the south. And obviously, we will be able to see through the online checker if a customer who's interested in getting broadband before the end of December 2021 finds out that their programme delivery is going to be beyond 2021, we're obviously able to use an interim voucher, which is at a lower value, to get an interim product in place to provide at least a super fast service while they wait for the longer term rollout under R100.
Stewart, is that okay? Minister, before we leave that, I have just a question on that. It's very difficult from the figures you've given of 250,000 households, because there are different values, as you disclosed in your inspired question answer earlier this week. How much is it going to cost each year, Minister, if everyone applies for a voucher? How much is it going to cost the Scottish Government?
Yeah, if you bear with me, Convener, I'll just find the appropriate figures. I don't want to misquote them. I have them here. We've obviously had to make some estimates based on modelling to understand the kind of demand that we might face. So it is something that we will keep under review, a stress, and obviously monitor on a regular basis. So if it looks like it's getting out of hand, we'll be coming back to the committee probably to inform you of that and keep you posted. But we believe the overall cost estimate for the Scottish Broadband Voucher Scheme as a whole is between 26.4 million and 50.7 million over a 5-year period. Now, obviously, the 5-year period relates to potentially, you obviously get invoiced in arrears and so forth, but there would be taking into account those properties that are really at the furthest extremities and need solutions. But that's based on between 20 and 40% take up. So that's why there's a range of between 26 and 50.7 million. In practice, it may be the case that some of the premises owners don't choose to get superfast. We can't force them to do that. But based on knowledge of voucher schemes elsewhere in the UK and modelling that, we believe we've modelled 20% to 40% take up. And This is also based on extending the main voucher eligibility in the North lot for 24 months as a modelling indicator, and the interim voucher eligibility until just the 31st of December 2021. Obviously, that's just to provide services up to that date, so it doesn't go beyond 2021. So the 5-year period is really the length of time for the main voucher scheme, the £5,000 per premises that we're offering for businesses and residential addresses.
So just to clarify, Minister, it could be more than that 57 million, and you're nervous about that because you said you could be coming back to the committee.
We feel pretty confident in the modelling based on what's been happening elsewhere in the UK with voucher take-up. Clearly, we have had situations before where we have seen take-up for DSSB, for example, exceeds initial modelling. So I just want to be open and honest with the committee that this is our best stab at it. It could go above that, but we will be very tightly monitoring the rollout of the voucher scheme, keeping a very close eye on the level of demand, and obviously internally within the Scottish Government, looking at that from a finance point of view, but obviously communicating to colleagues in finance and Rural Economy Committee, if we believe that is going to be there's going to be variance from that. But we will have a rigorous monitoring of the take-up of it. And I don't know whether perhaps, Convener, it might be appropriate to bring in Robbie McGee just to give you any more detail you might want on that.
Just before you do, Minister, if I could just clarify, in Wales, as I understand it, they've decided that due to the difficulties of the terrain in Wales, that for businesses the voucher scheme should be worth £7,000, not the £5,000 that we're getting in Scotland. Why did you settle on 5,000 and not the 7,000 figure that Wales had decided was appropriate? And indeed, their residential property figure is a bigger contribution as well.
In Wales, Convener, the situation has risen is the Welsh figures for residences are £3,000, but that includes £1,500 through the Rural Gigabit Voucher Scheme from the UK Government. So that's £1,500 plus £1,500. And similarly, the business figures are £3,500 plus £3,500. That's again including the Rural Gigabit Voucher Scheme value. I am hopeful, as I say, we've reached an agreement with the UK Government. We're still to iron out the details of this. We have been pushing UK ministers to match fund us directly, so that we're putting in 5,000 to either category of premises. So we've asked Mr Warman to consider directly matching that. If he's not able to, he will come back with a figure of what he can manage. But based on the existing rural gigabit voucher scheme figures, that would mean for a business in Scotland, if they were to use £3,500 as a UK contribution, that would be £8,500 for a business. And for a residential address, it would be £6,500. That's considerably more in both cases than is funded in Wales. We're confident that our voucher scheme will be attractive to suppliers on that basis. It is potentially the most generously funded one in the UK, and therefore that will prove to be attractive in bringing in suppliers to provide hopefully early access to customers that need it in areas of Scotland. So I hope that's helpful to you, Convener, and I hope to see more in the very near future.
And just one final question is, one of the concerns was when we originally went down as a committee down this line was we understand that the money invested was to cover the capital costs, but capital costs are only part of it. It's actually the running costs. So you could be in the Highlands and the only way you can use your voucher is for satellite, and it might be that satellite costs you £40 or £50 per calendar month to run, rather than £30 if you were on a fibre option in the Central Belt. And we were given an assurance that this would be looked at. Has this been now dropped?
No, Convener, we take that matter very seriously, and we have reflected your own questions on this, because we were concerned, obviously, to try and do what we could to meet the committee's interests. So for the Scottish Broadband Voucher Scheme to be eligible, the monthly cost must not exceed £46.10. That's the same figures as per month. That's the same figure as used for the universal service obligation. And we, in our discussions with suppliers such as satellite and fixed wireless suppliers, they are indicating to us they may be able to make some customer savings, reflecting the fact that there is a government investment, public investment in the infrastructure. It's obviously saving them money. They may be able to bring down their own costs. So I would hope in practice it will be well below that £46.10 figure. That's the upper ceiling. We are working with suppliers to try and negotiate a more competitive funding for recognising the concerns that you and others have raised, Convener. and I think Mr. Rumble's raised a similar point as well, who's sadly not with us today. But it may be helpful if we can perhaps bring in either Robbie or Clive, just because they've been more closely involved in negotiations, that we can give more detail on that. Yeah.
Minister, there's some questions on this, so I mean, I'd quite like to bring in Colin Smyth, because he's got some questions, and it may be then appropriate to bring in your officials. Colin, do you want to come in with your questions?
Yeah, thank you very much, Convener. Yeah, it's just to follow up on some of those questions around the vouchers. Can I ask the Minister, are there any restrictions or exclusions on the type of technology that the voucher scheme covers, and is he confident that all the interventions that will be covered will achieve a speed of greater than 30 for everyone who uses the voucher scheme?
Yes, I mean, on that latter point, it's an absolute requirement that for it to be eligible, it has to deliver more than 30 megabits per second speed. The technology will not be accepted if it will not deliver that for the customer, because it's not a super fast solution. There's no point in us funding something that's below the speed which we've set for the policy. We've also agreed a number of requirements that there would be in technology terms. I'm just going to try and find the right ones, Convener, to make sure that I've got that detail for you, and Mr. Smith. But we have set some technical restrictions, as the member said. I mean, certainly when it comes to the interim voucher, we are technology agnostic, in the sense that it's up to the customer to choose whether they want satellites, fixed wireless. There may be a possibility, if they're that kind of expense, to actually provide a fibre connection if fibre is close to the premises. Whatever the solution is, that goes. That's to provide an interim product that will take them up to the point they get their R100 investment in place. For the main voucher scheme, we have put restriction. If I can't find it, I will definitely bring it back to the committee. But there's a number of, I think, a small number of criteria. I've got them here actually. So the first one is a connection speed greater than 30 megabits per second. The second one is a step change in service, classifies at least doubling of either the current download or upload speed, and mirroring the best practice identified by Building Digital UK, BD UK, in the delivery of their own voucher schemes. And the third is a service with no prohibited data caps, so that there's no suddenly you get over a certain level of data usage and get punished financially for that. And a service that costs, as I said to the convener, less than £46.10, in line with the affordability criteria determined by Ofcom, which may change over time itself, of course, for services delivered under the universal service obligation. Hope that's helpful to Mr. Smith.
Colin.
Just following up on those criteria, it sounds as if the actual cost cannot exceed the value of the voucher. I mean, would there ever be a circumstance where households and communities have to meet additional costs themselves because the voucher doesn't cover an intervention that would be needed to get those levels of speed in their household?
We are pretty confident that, having looked at the technologies involved, clearly we are hopeful we'll have positive news from Mr. Warman and myself jointly on collaboration on topping up, using UK government voucher to top up, and then that will mean there's an even bigger budget than we're already allocating through the SBVS itself, and we're also collaborating on the use of the Rural Gigabit Voucher platform to be able to administer the voucher scheme. Well, that may take some months to set up, so we'll have to do something in the interim. But the hope is that, and this is maybe Robbie or Clive can confirm this, that we believe the value that we put in place should cover the vast majority of situations. But I appreciate Mr. Smith may have a point. There may be isolated examples where the costs exceed that. We're trying to avoid having an absolute cap on costs, and obviously we'll take that into consideration. But perhaps Robbie and Clive can explain how we would handle that if a property came forward needing a voucher, but the costs were just over the limit or something like that, and what discretion we might apply in that situation.
Robbie, do you want to come in on that?
As the Minister said, there could be a kind of sliding scale. So we're really confident, given the modelling that's been undertaken, that the voucher values that are on offer, which are pretty significant and go beyond what's existed in other voucher schemes in the UK, that should enable some really future-proof solutions, indeed full fibre solutions potentially. Beyond that, it's very much an up to amount. I mean, there will be situations where if full fibre is not possible, with the voucher value that we have. Then obviously there are other technologies, other really robust technologies that could be supported, and the Minister's mentioned some of those. So obviously, I mean, we'll keep this under review, but I think the opportunity exists with the £5,000 subsidy, potentially supplemented by the voucher funding that's available at UK level, to deliver something really future-proofed and transformational. But clearly, we'll keep that under review as we roll out and understand the pipeline.
Colin, do you want to follow that up?
Just one final brief point, Minister. You gave a figure, I think, for the estimated cost of the overall voucher scheme. Can I ask if you have a figure for the estimated cost specifically for the interim voucher scheme? And could you confirm, obviously, this funding would not have been required if R100 had ran to schedule?
Well, I mean, I should say on that latter point, I accept that the timescales have moved beyond the end of 2021, but we're trying to honour the commitment that we gave. The policy commitment was to deliver superfast services to customers before the end of 2021, and this is our means of trying to honour that, where it's essential for a customer to have that, rather than wait for, say, a future-proofed R100 full fibre solution for the premises, which in the case of Mr Smith's region will be entirely the outcome for those premises, that with the exception of 194 in the south, and the south is bigger than the typical definition of south of Scotland. I should stress, so there's areas of Ayrshire and Lanarkshire that are in there as well. But there's just 194 that will need the solution under the main scheme. The others will be in the south, would be taking up the interim voucher scheme if they are beyond that key deadline. You know, at £400 a premises, I appreciate that is an additional cost, but we're also recognising, as I said at the very outset of this meeting, how important digital connectivity now is. It's not just a nice to do; it's become an absolutely essential lifeline service, if you like, to use the term we use for ferries and things. People are able to now access medical care and other very essential services, and so we recognise the severity of a situation, and particularly in the recent pandemic where people didn't have that connectivity, that they're at a significant disadvantage. And yes, I appreciate its additional costs. We always assumed there would be some aligned interventions that might be required for premises that were out with the R100 scope. The interim voucher is, though, an additional requirement, and I accept that, and it would be contained within that overall envelope, though, I think, unless I just check with Mr McGee if there's any additional cost there. But I do believe that figure I quoted includes certainly the main voucher scheme, but we can come back to committee on any costings for the interim voucher, which will be demand-led, obviously. I might be able to give some indication, if it would be helpful to committee, about what we're expecting in the 2021 financial year and 2021-22. If that's helpful, we could do that in writing, if that would be more appropriate for you, Convener, to put it in writing.
Thank you. Rachel Hamilton, you had some questions, I think. Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Minister, on the website it says that the commercial networks cover 94% of Scotland, and it says you'll be able to order a service from at least one of them. Can I just confirm what the remaining 6% is? Are those the areas within that group that cannot actually access those commercial operators, and then will have either an interim voucher or the voucher?
It's an important question, because Ms Hamilton has raised, because obviously we are in an industry where most of the delivery has been commercial, albeit we've had intervention through DSSB collectively with UK Government, other partners, and now R100 in our own programme. We do have parallel investments going on. City Fibre, Openreach and Virgin are, I suppose, the main players in this respect who are doing build. Openreach just very recently announced a number of investments which will affect Ms Hamilton's constituency, for example. So there is build, I can see, in Borders and Galashiels, Tweedbank, Peebles. I appreciate Tweedbank, Peebles and Galashiels are outside Ms Hamilton's constituency, but Selkirk and Hoyk, for example, will be getting billed commercially by Openreach as part of I think it's 60,000 premise, 60 towns, 250,000 homes that they are building commercially at the moment. So R100 is, as we said before, one of three planks of this: the R100 procurement contracts, the three contracts, the commercial build, and the work we've just been discussing through the voucher scheme, which will be across a range of different suppliers, obviously, that will be providing those services. So I'm not quite sure if I've fully answered Ms Hamilton's question, but if I haven't, please do come back and I'll try and complete the answer. But it's a significant number of premises that are being built commercially, and we can provide some detail to the committee of the ones we know about from City Fibre, Openreach and Virgin, and we also potentially believe that Axion, who are one of the potential contractors that dropped out, are continuing to progress their own plans commercially in Scotland as well.
Rachel,
yes, please, Convener. So can I just confirm, Minister, that for those people who are looking for alternative solutions, there isn't actually a list of local suppliers. I wondered if you'd been having conversations with local suppliers that know the areas very well and know the issues within particularly rural areas like my constituency, know the lie of the land and can deliver effectively the solutions that you are looking for, or indeed households are looking for.
Apologies if I slightly misunderstood your first remarks, Ms Hamilton. Absolutely, we are engaging with suppliers, commercial suppliers, to assist us with the voucher scheme delivery, and we're aiming to go live with the vouchers in September. There is actually a workshop being held tomorrow with a range of suppliers, and hopefully ones which Ms Hamilton was referring to in the borders have been able to be part of that. Obviously we will eventually draw up a list of approved suppliers who meet the criteria we set out earlier to Mr Smith, and they'll be eligible for deployment on the voucher scheme. And we are encouraging suppliers also to being the ability to market. So once they've got access to list of properties that they know are eligible for voucher funding, it will be from both sides. The individual can go on the online checker, see they're eligible for a voucher if they're not being covered by a commercial bill or R100 bill by the end of 2021, or indeed that they're not going to get R100 at all, then they'll be eligible for either the main or interim voucher schemes. And but equally, suppliers will then know who they are and be able to market to them, hopefully in a regulated way, so that the possibility of aggregating builds in areas to try and get more efficient solutions for the supplier as well as for the customer, which may help bring costs down as well, as we discussed with the convener.
Thank you, Minister. Now, John Finney, you have some questions, I think, as well. John.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. Good morning, Minister and colleagues. Minister, due to the comprehensive nature of many of your replies, questions I had have been covered. Perhaps if I can just briefly touch on 2 points. I was going to ask you about discussions with the UK government about a joined-up funding. You alluded to that. It's just a request that perhaps you keep the committee apprised of any ongoing discussions. That would be appreciated, please. And finally, there's been a lot of discussion about eligibility criteria, which is largely focused on technical matters. And I'm not a technical person. I just wonder, with regard to the eligibility criteria, if there's any eligibility criteria applying to the individual. Is it means tested, whatever, please?
Minister.
Certainly, it's a very important question that Mr Finney asked. In terms of eligibility for those accessing the voucher scheme, effectively anyone who cannot access superfast broadband by the end of 2021 will be eligible for a voucher, regardless of whether or not the build is through the R100 contracts or commercial deployment will ultimately reach them. However, the SBVS will feature different eligibility criteria depending on the premises status in the reaching 100% contracts themselves. So a main voucher will offer funding of up to 5,000, as we discussed previously. We'll have a permanent connection to those properties for which there's no rollout of superfast broadband planned commercially or through R100. An interim voucher will offer funding of up to £400 or with a potential £250 top up for the hardest to reach properties for those premises where superfast broadband rollout is planned after the end of 2021, either through R100 and commercially. We'll ensure that those in the most difficult to reach premises can actually get additional help. That might require perhaps a relay point if they're using fixed wireless or something like that, or maybe more technically challenging, of course, to put in satellite option if they've got mountains around them, that kind of thing. So so it provides a little bit of extra cover, but we're also thinking of island costs as well, additional costs of delivery solutions to get contractors onto islands. There will be some locally based, of course, but those contractors who are eligible, who are supplying to islands, may charge a bit more because of their accommodation costs or whatever. So so that's hopefully helpful, but there's limits. And in terms of discussion with the UK government, it's primarily been through Mr. Warman, my counterpart and Parliamentary Under Secretary of State, and been very constructive so far. We have an agreement in principle. We're still to work out the actual figures, but I imagine it will start from the from the point that it would be at least the standard figures that RGVS offer, as I set out to the convener. So hopefully it will be a positive outcome, and we'll continue to try and build a good relationship there. I think there's a recognition in the UK government through DCMS that any work we do in Scotland will contribute to their overall aims and targets. We continue to have discussions around how the £5 billion gigabit commitment that the Prime Minister has made will be allocated, and we have had constructive discussions with Mr. Warman about where that could have most impact in Scotland. So, for example, I can't talk about the North Lot area, but similar principles might apply. I will just park that one there. But for the Central Lot area, where we know there's some fibre to cabinet build, which is really important because it's quite early, we'd be ordering cabinets, or BT would be ordering cabinets for that programme. So if we can get an early decision from UK ministers about any of that funding perhaps being used to flip from FTTC to fibre to the premises, which might take longer to build, and I just flagged it up in advance. It's a choice we have to make, but it is a future-proof solution. It may be a better solution. So taking our delivery of fibre to premises in that area up from north of 70% to obviously 100% like we're doing in the south, that would be a very practical use of any UK government money to try and provide for that additional investment to flip premises from FTTC to FTTP, and that's something that we've suggested Mr. Warman to consider, but it's obviously ultimately up to UK ministers how they spend the money they're planning to invest.
Thank you, Minister. Chapman, I think you've got some questions next. Peter.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Minister, my questions are around the online checker. Can you firstly confirm that the online checker is now up and running and working satisfactorily?
It's up and running as of yesterday. We had some issues with error messages that were coming up, but I'm not proud of the fact the team are having to work overnight, but the team have been working overnight to fix that, and I understand it has been fixed. So we can. There were some difficulties that arose where somebody was perhaps checking a second property, or maybe putting a code incorrectly, then put in a second one, a correct code, and because there's some additional protections on the online checker to avoid the data being harvested or scraped by automated means from the checker to protect people's privacy under GDPR, protect the commercial sensitivity of the data for the developers. There was some additional protection put in, and that unfortunately led to these error messages, but the team have been working that overnight, so hopefully it's now working effectively, with the one proviso that we still have this address database issue that Mr. Stevenson referred to earlier, which is an issue. The other factor which we're looking at is that we pointed to the Ofcom website, and there's a link there to a website that tells you what services are available in your area, and there are some examples where we know the area is now enabled for superfast already, but Ofcom's database is still telling you you're not. So we're just flagging up there's an issue there we may have to address in terms of the our information. We believe is much more up to date than that. That's ironically on that link that Ofcom point to. So with those two qualifications that there were some teething issues, I'm happy to say the online checkers up and running. It's a very complex exercise, may appear very simple from the point of view of the consumer, and if that's the case, then we are doing our job correctly, because we're trying to keep it simple, keep the language simple, and avoid jargon. But there's a heck of a lot of work has gone in to trying to pull together all the different data sets from different developers into one place to provide effectively 7 different scenarios someone will encounter when they put their postcode in. And we can send details to the committee of what the messages would be in each of those 7 situations, so that all members can see what you would expect to get. if you're under the different scenarios in terms of R100 coverage or not, commercial or not, and voucher eligibility, so that the committee's got them to hand, if that would be helpful, Convener. But we're satisfied it is now working, and we'll keep an eye on it though, and obviously monitor any issues that arise.
So for that, I mean, I did actually try it last night myself, and all I got was an error came up. So hopefully that's moved on. And I think you've possibly answered quite a bit of my second follow-up question, which was about keeping the information up to date, and you know, the commercial providers will be working away, and we need to be sure that their input into the thing is correct, and that data sharing is taking place, and therefore that we can be assured that it's an up-to-date answer that we're getting. So I think you've kind of covered that. So the only other thing I have is, how are you going to roll out the communication about the programme and let folk know that it's there and it can be accessed? I mean, there needs to be a wee bit of advertising done, I would argue, that to let folk know that this is there, and they can now find out what their scenario is as far as getting a fast link, internet link. So is there going to be some kind of communication and programme to let the general public know this scheme this facility is there?
Absolutely, we will be doing marketing proactively of this, as was the case with DSSB. I'm not sure if Mr. Chapman has had anything through his door in recent years from the Digital Scotland Superfast Broadband Programme advertising, you know, the availability, the potential for services that are now in your area, and be able to take that up. A similar exercise we've done by R100. We're very keen also to work with all MSPs and all MPs and indeed elected members to try and make it more generally, to make sure that everyone has the information you need to communicate to your own stakeholders and communities, to let them know the opportunities as they're arising. Mr. Chapman's absolutely right about keeping this live, the online checker. The system that's in place at the moment is probably at the minimum level of sophistication it needs to have at the moment. It will become more sophisticated and more nuanced over time. So as we get the detail of the survey work that's happening at local areas, obviously it's not started at all in the north, it is well underway now in the south and central areas. As that granularity of information is fed in by BT and Openreach as to the build and the timescales, that will then start to be reflected in more detailed information on the online checker for those that plug in, to get a more accurate projection as to when the build may happen. Obviously at the moment we're just telling people whether it's pre or post December 2021, so they know about whether they can use interim voucher or not, but we'll get into more sophistication there. If I may, I'm not sure whether it would be Clive or Robbie. I imagine it would be Clive, Convener. If I can maybe bring in my colleague Clive just to say something about how we'll engage with the developers to try and keep the information live and up to date, and maybe say something about the marketing as well, if that's possible.
It is of course possible, Minister, providing Clive keeps his comments as brief and succinct as possible. Sorry, Clive.
No, absolutely. Succinct is the watchword, Convener. So in terms of keeping the data fresh, we have relationships with all of the operators, large and small, across Scotland, and we engage them on a quarterly basis to get their latest build plans. As the committee will be aware, we're not allowed to intervene where they have their own commercial plans, so we're very keen to be clean from a state aid point of view. The data we take not at face value. We check and cross-check with Ofcom database, which we mentioned, and with Address Space, which is a Northern Survey database. That then will feed into the data that supports the online checker. Similarly, plans go out as well as come in, so we're very keen where a commercial player has, for whatever reason, deemed an area to be non-commercial and has decided not to fulfil their plans. Obviously that is of great interest to us in case we need more, to cover more premises. On the marketing, as has been discussed, we have from the 2.9 million or so addresses in Scotland, we are dealing with a fairly small cohort, very important cohort, but that makes them addressable almost on an individual basis, that we know, who is in need of superfast broadband, and we have channels where we can market to them pretty much directly. I hope that's answers that question.
Okay, and Peter's indicated to me on the other means that has answered his question. So we're able to go on to the next question, which is from the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen, your questions.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, mine are kind of more COVID related, just in terms of the R100 programme in Central and South, where it has been able to go ahead. Has there been much COVID related delay, if you like, in terms of physical deployment of the broadband infrastructure? And I suppose, do Openreach think that they make that up?
We certainly we do recognise that there will bound to be some impact on the business, given staff would have been sort of working from home and various other things. But I'm pleased to say that I think largely speaking that there hasn't been a significant impact of COVID-19 on the delivery. But we'll obviously have to wait to see if ongoing constraints, if you like, as a result of coronavirus and the difficulties around build and the different working practices that have to be put in place for teams on the ground will have any impact. But we certainly think that with respect of COVID-19, it's not had as damaging an impact as perhaps we initially feared when the pandemic unfolded. So I'm reasonably confident we will make good progress. Clearly, as indicated earlier on, but not perhaps in much detail, that we having regular discussions with BT and Openreach around what we can do to accelerate activity. I've certainly welcomed their commitment. They are trying to do what they can to adjust. There's obviously a bit of a tension there. Obviously, if we are going to make a change around the central lot area around fibre to cabinet and not using that technology, but flipping to fibre to premises, we need to know pretty quickly, or else we might have to hold off. And so longer we have to hold off waiting for an agreement with UK ministers, if there is one to come on funding, then that would be helpful to get that decision very early, so we can make that procurement decision, or BT can. But I'm hopeful that we can catch up to some degree. But we have the ability with the interim voucher to protect consumers from being harmed, if you like, if there's slower delivery because of coronavirus. The interim voucher, subject to any requirements on the contractors, of course, for safety for themselves and the customers, that can hopefully help catch up and help people at least access super fast while they wait for something better in the longer term.
Okay, so the Scottish Government's response to the advisory group on economic recovery does include a number of actions relating to investing in our digital capabilities for economic recovery. Apart from the Logan Review, many of the actions highlighted did exist prior to COVID-19. So I suppose, can you comment at this stage of any additional and further detail on the role of digital infrastructure in stimulating Scotland's recovery? And I think as background, perhaps you could indicate whether, as Minister for Digital Connectivity, whether you've had a lot of complaints from the public in terms of their connectivity during COVID. I mean, I can say that I've had nothing over and above what existed before, apart from, I think, one farmer on an NFU briefing who was complaining. But in terms of emails on connectivity, I've had none. I just wondered whether you'd had lots.
On that, I mean, I would stand corrected if Robbie McGee has got more accurate, because I tend to see the ones that come through elected members, so MSPs, MPs, councillors, and I would say there's been a huge surge. We did have certainly some constituents or colleagues around the country who were keen to see digital infrastructure in place, because they were very conscious of the fact they were losing out by comparison with others. But I wouldn't say it was a huge number. I think most people probably understood the circumstances that we were in, and we've worked very closely with the industry itself to try and make sure that we got good guidance out, working with CWU, the Communication Workers Union, and employers, try and get appropriate health and safety guidance in place issue from the Scottish Government to allow activity to resume. So we were already allowing sort of maintenance and repair work to go on, but we quite quickly realised that with appropriate safety measures it would be possible, particularly in rural areas where people were isolated from other population, that build could continue. So we reached that position. The Deputy Convener is absolutely right. The AGER report did highlight a number of areas which are already in train. So the R100, the Scottish 4G infill programme, the establishment of Scotland's 5G centre, support for SMEs to adopt digital technologies through things like Digital Boost, and actions to enhance our national data infrastructure. So a lot of that was already going on beforehand, but I suppose it's probably a recognition that we all now realise just how important it is, even more so than we thought before. And the range of services through the innovation that's happened during the pandemic that are now provided online. And you can now see that digital technology may also contribute to reducing climate emissions. Not through choice, we've had the change in our working practices, but it has revealed that perhaps more is possible than we thought before, and perhaps people's attitudes are changing a little bit to home working. Personally, the novelty's worn off for me a little bit, I have to say. But equally, we've managed to maintain productivity by working from our homes and locally, and that may allow some reduction in future commuting. So I think it's very important that digital has been flagged up, and we're particularly welcome the fact that there's there's very strong support for continued build, and hopefully we'll be doing exactly that.
Maureen, is that you finished, or do you have a follow-up?
No, as well as the overarching use of connectivity in terms of economic recovery at a more granular level, is there an opportunity to prioritise broadband upgrades for households and businesses that need to diversify into e-commerce, or indeed children who have to work from home? Hopefully not, we don't have to go to a blended learning situation, but if indeed we have to, whether those would be given priority.
And it does touch a little bit on the points the convener was making as well around the cost of broadband as well. And yes, we're certainly prioritising through R100 rural areas. We're very conscious as well, I should say, there are some parts of urban areas that we haven't covered under the R100 procurement because we purposely focused on rural and island areas, but that those consumers will also be eligible through the voucher scheme, where there's no commercial plans for a particular area, whether it might be an impoverished area or low-income area of an urban area that needs that investment, and vouchers would be obviously potentially able to be deployed there. That's why the £250,000 figure that I quoted earlier on for the coverage of main voucher scheme is as large as it is, because there are some pockets in urban areas that will not be covered, we know, by commercial build, but we didn't cover through the R100 procurements themselves. I was really pleased to see my colleague Aileen Campbell announce the second phase of Connecting Scotland programme, because I think it does touch on some of the things that Ms Watt is referring there in terms of an additional £50 million of funding to support, I believe, 22,000 more households, families on low incomes and young care leavers who are digitally excluded, to get them online and to try and help them overcome any educational or economic disadvantage that they face. And as we discussed earlier, that maybe allows things access to medical care as well in the course of pandemics and so forth as well. So I hope that's one significant move to help the most vulnerable people in the society. But we're obviously continuing to try and do what we can to address that digital divide that still exists.
Thank you, Minister. We're going to move on to the next questions, which are from Richard Lyle. Richard.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, the 4G infill programme commits to the delivery of new masts, boosts the coverage of 4G in remote areas. This programme was suspended in March 2020 due to the COVID-19 crisis. The recent update states that the Scottish Government and the supplier, WHP Telecoms Limited, were starting to safely resume the build from June 2020. So can you tell me, the 4G infill programme was intended to deliver 45 new mast sites by 2022. Is this target still accurate?
Certainly, we're still working to those deadlines, Mr. Lyle, and we regard this as a very important part of our programme. As you rightly identify, initially there was 48 masts that we had in the list. There's a number that have dropped off the list because we couldn't secure a partner. We don't provide the phone services themselves, but a mobile network operator will do that for us. And we had to refine the list. There was one particular site in Pennon which was dropped because the local planning authority didn't give planning permission for the mast, so we couldn't take that forward, unfortunately, on behalf of the people of Pennon. But there's a revised list of 40 sites that we are taking for, and I'm pleased to say that 9 sites are in build or are completed. In February this year, the first one at New Luce in Dumfries and Galloway went live with work underway in Ettrick. I think that's just for Miss Hamilton's interest, that's just the power connection needs to be added. Strathconan, where the Home Office required to give clearance for the operators to start delivering the services, and there's others in Mains of Lairg, which might be of interest to Convener, Tarkavig, Applecross, Glenbar, Raywick, and Witcherfoot in the borders. So there's a number that are being progressed, but we've got a total list of 40 in this £25 million programme, and we are continuing to progress that. And we have had some help from the European Commission. I'm very grateful to them because they have given us an extension to June 2023 under the state aid scheme, so that we can extend delivery up to that date should we need that extra time because of coronavirus. Because as Mr Lyle indicated, the work did have to stop in March for safety reasons and is now resuming again.
Maybe you could send us the list of the 40, where they are and what stage they're at would be certainly helpful. I'll maybe run the next 2 questions together since the convener's looking at the time. What lessons have been learnt in terms of the delivery of the 4G infill programme as a result of the 27 of the original proposed sites across Scotland being removed from the programme? And Scotland's 5G strategy is now almost a year old. What has been achieved as a result of the strategy in the first year, and where can members access monitoring the evacuation evidence on the strategy, and any concerns by constituents in regard to the 5G strategy?
Well, certainly, I appreciate that 5G has become perhaps a more interesting topic than we expected because of some of the dafter stuff that was on the internet around 5G and its role in the coronavirus pandemic. 5G has been an entirely helpful technology, I would suggest, and in the future could be even more so. We obviously the health aspects, which were focused on by David Icke and some others, are issues which are looked at on our behalf by Public Health England, on behalf of all 4 nations, and their conclusions are it's perfectly safe. The 5G Centre, Scotland's 5G Centre is now progressed. We've now got Chief Executive and Chair have been in place since May, and the first wave of projects coming forward, and the rural theme, the district theme, and the Infralink project, which is led by Scottish Futures Trust, are progressing, and we can get in writing. Convener will give you some more detail on that just for purposes of time. On the wider points around, sorry, just if perhaps Mr Lyle can just remind me of his first point, if that's possible, Convener. I've lost my train of thought.
What lessons have been learned in regards to terms of the delivery of the 4G infill programme?
Yeah, I mean, I think it touches on some of the issues. Thank you, Mr. Lyle. It touches on some of the issues that I discussed earlier on. That in my first answer to you, that the critical nature of having the commercial partner in place. We've had very strong support from one particular mobile network operator, where there's a synergy between what we're doing and what they're trying to do around the emergency services network. And that's led to great support. We've had a number of masts supported by other MNOs, but there are we could perhaps do with a bit more engagement from others. If I may put it that way, to try and help us deliver truly improved network coverage. The other thing is there's opportunities, I suppose, arising out of the shared rural network investment that's being overseen by UK ministers on the commercial operators, which is very welcome development, and how we can collaborate between the delivery of that project and our own S4GI programme to deliver the 40 masts. And there may be opportunities where we're trying to deal with not spots, total not spots, and shared rural networks largely delivering, shall we say, partial not spots. where there's maybe weak signals, maybe between different operators, that we could maybe collaborate to try and help each other out and make sure we get the widest possible coverage. But in general, there's thankfully only one mast that's been rejected on planning grounds so far, which was a disappointment to know that community. But where we are there, we can't do anything about that. But we have tried to make sure that we're engaging closely with communities around siting of masts and make sure we can avoid that problem where possible.
The subject of 5G, thank you, Convener. You said I could come back in with one quick question. On the subject, thank you, Convener. On the subject of 5G, I don't have a concern, but I know a constituent has contacted me. Do you have any concern?
So it just went very quiet at the end there, Mr. Lyle. Do you have any concerns of?
Do you have any concerns about the convener is not happy about, but other members have asked a constituency question, so I will. Do you have any concerns about 5G?
On safety grounds, no. I mean, I think the potential of the technology, as I say, Public Health England on our behalf and other devolved governments on our behalf has looked at the safety evidence, and they've not found any evidence of health and safety risks to the public. Very important point actually made to us by the Communication Workers Union, who said we would refuse to build these if we thought they were dangerous for the communities in which they're working. I think that's for me, I know it may be a very simplistic way of looking at things, but I trust their judgment here. They don't want to harm the communities they live in, and they're saying we would not build this if we thought it was dangerous for the communities that are being served. And I think it's the potential in regions such as the conveners, for the digital healthcare and those kind of areas, the potential of 5G is enormous, and it could really help with mobility as a service in terms of transport innovation as well. So I very much welcome it, and I hope Scotland's 5G Centre can be at the heart of trying to deal with some of these concerns, and there are legitimate concerns communities have. I appreciate that. We need to give them the reassuring information that hopefully deals with that and make sure they're relaxed about investment in their area.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Mr. Lau, for being so honest and admitting your mistake in asking a constituency question. Other members are not so quick to come forward to say that they have made the same mistake as you, but I appreciate your honesty. Angus MacDonald, I believe you have some questions now. Angus.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I'll be as brief as I can. Can I ask the Minister for an update on discussions between Scottish Government and UK Government about the implications of the £5 billion gigabit capable broadband package for the funding of broadband interventions in Scotland? Specifically, how much of that £5 billion is Scotland likely to receive, and will it be used to replace some of the existing R100 funding sources, or be put toward a separate complementary projects?
Well, I thank Mr. MacDonald for the question. I touched on this earlier, but I suppose to give a more comprehensive answer. On the gigabit funding, we certainly welcome that in principle. There's two committees the UK Parliament have indicated in various ways to UK ministers that they believe that the UK Government needs to look again at the funding allocations to make sure that the particular geographic difficulties, topographical difficulties that we face in Scotland have been recognised by both those committees, and I very much welcome that. Members in correspondence rather than read them out. But they have made that point, and I think it is recognised. In fairness to Mr. Warman and his colleagues, I think they do recognise that Scotland has a disproportionate share of that last 5%. Now, it's about the mechanics of how do we come up with a way in which that funding can then be allocated in a timely way rather than having to go through state aid issues and so forth. And that's why we suggested as a positive initiative that perhaps, and I know there's very warm discussions going on between our officials and Mr. Warman's officials as well, that we look at potentially doing this work to flip from FTTC to FTTP, which is not cheap. It's obviously more expensive technology. It's a more future-proof solution. It meets the UK Government's objective of having gigabit delivery. Our commitment was around super fast, so we're very willing to move to that higher standard. But we're already funding 579 million from our own coffers, plus the interim vouchers and main voucher. So we could do with some help from UK ministers, and I think there's certainly a recognition of that. I don't want to try and speak for Mr Warman, but hopefully, and certainly welcome the committee's thoughts on this to Mr Warman, but we certainly welcome anything positive that UK ministers can do to contribute what we believe should be a more than population share of that £5 billion into addressing, particularly in the north and central areas, taking investment up to that kind of higher standard of delivery, which will satisfy both our targets and hopefully it'll be a good outcome for both governments.
Okay, thanks. Well, here's hoping. Can I move on to the USO? The UK government's universal service obligation went live in March this year. What impact has this had on Scotland?
It's pretty limited so far, I think it'd be fair to say. I mean, I know certainly the Rural Gigabit Voucher Scheme, last count I think, which is the UK government's voucher scheme, which we hope to help them improve take-up of, has been very limited in sort of double figures, I think, the number of properties that have benefited from that so far. But universal service obligation is obviously welcome. It will provide sort of a guarantee of 10 megabits per second for a customer that contacts BT, and even if BT isn't their service provider, they contact BT, they can request that the universal service obligation is delivered for their premises. And there is a cost cap though, which is the issue that's been, I think, a handicap in terms of the limited take-up there is in not just Scotland but other more challenging rural areas of the UK. That the cost cap is kicked in, and we discussed that in a previous session, I believe. Obviously, with our voucher scheme being in place, it's much more generously funded than that. We're confident that the funding we are committing, especially if it's combined with the RGVS money, will make a more substantial dent in those premises that are needing support. And obviously, our interim voucher, we believe, is sufficient to give people a super fast speed wherever they are in Scotland from a range of technologies. So the USO is an important contributor, is helping right now dealing with some of the worst cases. But now that the voucher scheme is in place and R100 is getting on the ground, hopefully we'll have a longer term, more future-proof solution for our customers that come from that route.
Okay, thanks. And finally from me, Convener, can I ask the Minister what impact will the telecommunications infrastructure leasehold property bill have on the rollout of broadband in Scotland?
Well, we certainly, from the point of view of, it is an important issue because it has a big bearing on the speed at which bill can be achieved, obviously dealing with things like wayleaves, and we have been trying to work collaboratively with UK ministers, so we support their efforts, particularly where it's concerned and maybe relevant to Mr MacDonald's constituency, where you've got buildings where there's multiple occupancy in terms of multiple tenants or owner occupiers, and that this will simplify and speed up the process. I appreciate there are issues around concerns that some landowners have around the ability of the developer to drive down the revenues that they get from the wayleaves, but we're certainly encouraging fairness in those discussions to sort of reflect that we don't want to see exploitation of the situation. But I think the measures that are going in place are, in theory, going to be helpful in terms of speeding up the delivery, and we are supportive of much of the measures that UK ministers are bringing forward through that particular legislation. But we're obviously keeping it under close watch to see what comes forward, and we'll obviously liaise with UK ministers if there are any concerns we have about what's proposed from a Scottish perspective.
Thank you. Angus, do you have any further questions, or are you content? I see Stewart Stevenson has one follow-up. Sorry, Angus, you finished, sorry.
I'm content, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Stewart, one more question from you, and then I've got one at the end, if I may, please. So, Stewart Stevenson, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's more an observation. The USO, they managed to find me to send me a letter to invite me to take it up, but I am similarly absent from the Ofcom database and therefore cannot do so. So if the Scottish Government's picking its database up from Ofcom, I now know why I'm not in the Scottish Government's database. It's a comment rather than a question. Thank you, Convener.
I'm sure that's the reason, and there's no malice aforethought from the Scottish Government. Minister, quick question from you, if I may. Given that a lot's gone under the bridge since you started on delivering R100 and broadband across Scotland, can I just ask you when you think you would have needed to awarded the contracts to ensure that R100 was delivered by 2021? What year?
Well, it's a tough question, that, because obviously a lot has happened that we know of now, like the pandemic and various things, although it hasn't disrupted as badly as we feared, as I said earlier. I think that's a hard question to answer. I don't know whether Robbie, who's been involved throughout, might have a better estimate there he can provide for your convener. But I'd hesitate to guess. Obviously, we had some issues along the way with changes to the, as I outlined in a previous response to Mr. Stevenson, actually in parliamentary question, some of the factors that have driven us off path in terms of legal challenges from potential contractors. We've obviously got one now in the north, with threats of legal action, issues to do with changes in which is, as I've said before, is not a criticism of UK ministers, this, but they changed the scope for what DSSB could deliver, which meant there was less ability to use funding that was available through Gainshare to deliver more fibre to cabinet, which is, it's a good outcome to get fibre to premises, but the hit rate, if you like, has dropped, and that's meant many more properties come back into scope for R100. So there's so many things that are kind of blown us from side to side on the way. It'd be difficult to say, but unless Robbie or Clive has got some insight to that, I couldn't really suggest it.
I'm very happy to ask Robbie to come in on that. I mean, my comment is you've told us that the pandemic has actually not delayed things too badly, because ordering and some preparation works can still going on. So Robbie, when would the contracts have had to have been issued? Because presumably all the things that have slightly blown the government, of course, would have been factored into the planning process. Do you have an idea of the year when they would have needed to be delivered?
I think it's really difficult to alight upon a particular point in time. I mean, I think there's so many variables within it, and I think in particular, even just the type of technology that we were contracting upon, if it had been a different, more straightforward, fibre to the cabinet type solution primarily, it would have taken, it would have taken far less time to deploy. And obviously, in some respects, we're kind of victims of our own success. We've managed to get a lot more full fibre. It does take longer to deploy, so it is really, really difficult to light upon a date and time where, if we'd been able to sign on the basis of the current contracts, we would have hit 2021. So, just too many variables, I think, to come up with something conclusive or definitive.
Thank you, Robbie. And on that note, we probably reached the fact that it was an impossible promise in 2016 on the basis we didn't know when it could be delivered by. So but maybe we'll leave that hanging in the air as a final comment. And I'd like to thank the Minister and all his officials for coming in and participating in this remote meeting. And that concludes today's committee business. And therefore, I close the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.